Okay, we are recording now.
If they're talking in the room, we can't hear them.
Okay, yeah. So welcome, everybody. I appreciate your patience as we worked out the audiovisual kinks. Let's just start with brief introductions. We'll go around the table and then could you call on people on Zoom to introduce themselves? So starting with Jenny.
Hi, Jenny Tolton, blood dairy farmer. I sit in a seat appointed for agriculture.
I'm Diane Rowland. I'm the Dean of the College of Natural Sciences, Forestry and Agriculture at the University of Maine and Director of the Experiment Station.
I'm Jim Buckle from Buckle Farm and Unity, and we are organic vegetable and fruit growers. I sit on here as part of agriculture.
Beth Valentine, Director of the PFAS Fund.
Stacy Brenner. I sit here as a legislator, but I also happen to be a farmer.
Adrienne Lee, New Beet Farm in Knox, Maine. I sit on here representing agriculture, also grow mixed organic mixed vegetables and cut flowers.
I'm Melanie Loisum, Commissioner of the Department of Environmental Protection.
Right, and then we will give this a go and we'll move through folks on Zoom, and I'll just call your name, Sherry Hamill.
Good afternoon. I'm Sherry Hamill, the State Executive Director at Farm Service Agency.
And Becca.
Hi, everyone. Becca Bolitz, Executive Director at Maine Public Health Association. I'm on here because of my public health background, and then I'm also the co-chair of the Health Subcommittee.
And Senator Bennett.
Hi, all. Rick Bennett from Oxford, Maine. And I'm going to be in and out of the meeting because I'm also over here in AFA Appropriations Committee hearings all day. So apologies for coming and going. Thanks.
And Andy Smith. We just Isaac Benowitz.
Hi, I'm Isaac Benowitz. I'm the Chief Medical Officer and State Epidemiologist at Maine CDC, and I'm the co-chair for the Health Subcommittee with Becca Bullis. Thanks.
This is on a subcommittee.
All right, based on Zoom, I think that's everyone that's on the committee for introductions. There's a bunch of folks on subcommittees that are here, but we will wait on that for later.
Okay, so I just wanted to give sort of a quick update of where we are in terms of stepping up subcommittees and get some input from this group on the definition of impacted farmer. I'll start by discussing the public hearing held January 11th at the Agricultural Trade Show. Tom, could you advance one slide, please? I did not bring paper copies of anything. The feedback we received was consistent with where this advisory committee had been going already. Focus on making farmers whole, on immediate support to give farmers some cushioning to allow them the time to do the research, get the test results, to figure out what changes could be incorporated to allow the farm to remain viable. There's an emphasis on research that would allow informed decision making. here we go, here's the list. Food safety is a primary concern. It's important to disseminate the funds as quickly as possible. The farms don't go out of business. There's a recommendation that farms exposed to PFAS through military operations, as well as those impacted via the spreading of biosolids included. There's a request that some of the funds be dedicated to research on wool production, so fiber as opposed to meat or something or food items. A recommendation that we investigate the impact of PFAS contamination and dust. So the inhalation exposure pathway as opposed to drinking water. There's also a recommendation that an impacted farm be used as a research site. So for these recommendations have been shared with the subcommittees working on the different areas. And also the same list is in the draft report to the legislature. So there are a number of reports coming up. May 1, both this advisory committee and the Department of Agriculture, Conservation and Forestry have reports due to the legislature on our work to date. I emailed the advisory committee the draft report from the committee to the legislature. So I want to spend some time later on today talking about what's in there is pretty bare bones because the subcommittees really have just started their work and we're not at the stage of being ready to share those recommendations yet. But is it too bare bones? Yeah. And also we can include legislative recommendations. I want, and it's a little bit funny, like I'm not sure the protocol for submitting a report from the advisory committee separate from the department's report. Our report will be a little bit more comprehensive and it will go to 3 joint standing committees. This committee's report will go just to Agriculture, Conservation and Forestry and Environment and Natural Resources. The departments will also go to Health and Human Services Committee. And there's a lot of overlap. I pretty much cut and paste this and committee's report directly into the department's report. So one of our recommendations as the department will likely be that we don't do 2 reports that are largely duplicative. Beyond that, are there other legislative changes this committee wants to recommend? Tom, will you advance one, please? So when we last met in December, we went through what I called a discussion guide where it laid out all of the potential uses of the fund as identified in the statute. And we discussed as a committee which of those we would pursue and which we would put on a back burner. And based on those conversations, I set tasks for the advisory committee to look at the priority areas identified by this group. So each of the subcommittees have begun work. As a reminder, they are the financial and business support, land transfer, research, and health. In one form or another, each of the committees has asked, well, what is an impacted farm? So I'm sharing this definition, which is what the department presently uses for the department's existing financial resources available to farmers. So it's a commercial farm with a water test result of 20 parts per trillion or higher, and or a soil test that exceeds Maine CDC's current crop-specific screening levels. And as well as either the water test or the soil test, one or more sample of a farm product showing PFAS at levels deemed of concern by Maine CDC. So this is our working definition of a commercial farm. And there's one other element. Tom, will you please advance one more? The statute establishing the PFAS fund defines a commercial farm as a farm that produces any farm products with the intent that the farm product be sold or otherwise disposed of to generate income. That is a very broad definition of a commercial farm. The department also, so in addition to the water and soil and farm product tests, the department also includes a farming income of at least $2,000 per year. So all that together means presently for a farm to be eligible for support from the PFAS fund, they need either a water or soil test showing above the specified levels. They need to have PFAS at a level of concern in a farm product and have a gross annual farming income of at least $2,000. I'm proposing that we use the same definition for all programs that would directly support farmers. So that would be the financial and business support as well as land transfers. The health, it seems like maybe having the element of the farm product isn't as relevant to health concern. Maine CDC and public health physicians, not explaining this well. For an impacted farmer to be eligible, for example, for blood testing, it may make sense to drop that third element that the farm product have be deemed of concern, because the general issue is whether they've been exposed to contaminated water or soil. Jenny?
Just to clarify, because I'm always stymied by punctuation in the word and. In order to qualify, you have to hit 2 of those 3? Or could it possibly be just your product is testing? Because I'm thinking of if the source is not your water and not your soil, but the feed that you bring in. And if that causes your product to be above the threshold, and there's a couple products out there that have really low thresholds now, and then you would lose your milk license there, I'll go there. So I mean, does that mean that if your soil and your water is fine, but your product is bad, does it mean you don't qualify? That's what I want to know.
That's a fair question. So
And I feel bad, I meant to ask this at our last 2 subcommittee meetings, but I thought I understood it, and I just want to make sure.
right, no, so like this is the working definition the department's using. But yeah, so my inclination would be that if your milk, your farm product tests above the action threshold, then you ought to be
But is that the way it reads?
It does not, it's not the way it reads
Very
the way. Yeah.
True.
Just to clarify what you're saying, Jenny, is that you want to make sure that the business is made whole, regardless of whether it's the soil or the water or the product, or a combination of all of them, or just one of them.
I want to make sure that they're eligible for the services, because these services will not make them whole. I don't like to use that phrase, but yes, sorry. Don't mean to be into semantics, but yeah, so I just want to make sure that the definition.
Several farm products. Right, because if you're not raising your hay, you're buying all your hay, what corn silage or whatever,
Right,
that's someone else's product that you're purchasing.
yeah, if your water is fine, I mean, because then you're left in a conundrum. A really bad conundrum if you can't find the source, if it's not the water and it's not your soil.
We want the business to be able to be eligible to pivot and have the support it needs to.
Yes, because they will need the support, just like anyone else.
How does the definition of commercial farmer resonate for you?
Resonates fine. As I'm curious how someone who's not affected by licensing or regulations or requirements fits into that, or if they do, i.e. food sovereignty issues, I mean, if you're not required, if you don't have to test your well because you live in a community, I mean, I wonder how that fits in, but I think I'm getting wonky there. But the definition seems to, as long as it's, I mean, as long as that threshold is continued, has a continuity with how the USDA and the department does with regards to income and stuff like that.
So are you suggesting that it be water test or soil test or farm product test?
I'd like to say that it seems like you've gotta have one way, it's almost like the product is like the primary, right? Whether it's yours or not. And then it, like, I think of it as like, you could have contaminated water or contaminated soil, but not have any contaminated products. Whereas you can have contaminated products and not have any contaminated soil or water. So I wonder if it's almost like that way needs to be like flipped around as far as the primary thing is like the products are contaminated. And then it's or soil and water. Or I'm not sure.
Except for dairy, would there be an instance where a farm product would be tested prior to water or soil testing?
Yeah,
Definitely, yeah.
yeah.
We have a question online, not sure if it's relevant right now. It's from Evan Sumner asking, are there any research and remediation subsidies included in this fund?
You can let Evan know that for folks that aren't on the committee, we're not going to take questions through the chat. It's just for on anything substantive, it's just for logistics.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I think along the same lines of what you two are saying is that there's also, maybe I'm not understanding this fully, but there's a gray area between when my water, soil, and products get tested and I get my results back. And so would I not be eligible until something's discovered? Meaning if there's a cause for alarm, like I farm a spread site, like practically I know what's gonna happen here. And then I have cause for alarm and I have to stop doing what I'm doing to wait the 5 to 6 weeks. Then what happens in that gray zone? These are like two gray zones. It seems like farmers can get really hung up on, like, yeah, if you don't produce your corn silage, but then that person who did starts to test their stuff and then it's gonna fall back on you. Then you to trigger into.
And one of the comments at the public hearing was that there was testing that was going on. And it was at the cost and loss of the farmers and the farmer-owned cooperatives. And it was for simply going through the testing site. So would that apply? So I mean, but it's clear, but just so I'm on the right page, or I know what I'm talking about, this right now, if it was, say it was my milk came up, I would not be eligible for anything being proposed if it was just my milk.
Which is probably not the intention, but you're right, it does look like how it reads there, right?
But if your milk had been contaminated from feed you purchased in, then we want to be able to serve your farm.
Right, I don't think anyone here intends to exclude someone if that's the case.
We need to redraft that language in order to make it more inclusive.
Yeah, we would.
I would also just maybe add, as if that also kind of brings up as we go through the subcommittees and determine, like, especially with like the financial business support committee, like how it seems like there's going to ultimately be like different forms of supports for a farm that just has milk contamination compared to a farm that has soil and water contamination. And so like, how do we parse that out? If you're able to, in a couple of years, clear up the milk, or hopefully less than that, but because it's not your own farm feed, but if you compare, but like, so would you be how much like infrastructure support would you be qualified for that in comparison to like, if it was your, yeah, I have no idea, I just bringing up that we'll need to like, you should use this definition, but we also need to like start or amend it, but then also think about how things are gonna kind of, as we start suggesting ways to provide supports to farms, we're gonna have to kind of dig a little deeper beyond just this definition and not to be just probably as.
So for clarification, then the capitalized and should be an and or. Then it would essentially hit any three of those issues.
Is there possibly a reason why the state, the department has it this way? I'm wondering though.
Yeah, so the department is concerned with agriculture and, you know, the safety of food and commerce. And so that's why that final element is there. If, you know, in my home garden at home, I had, you know, bad soil, bad water, but I was just growing tomatoes for myself. The department doesn't, it's not that they don't care, but it's not their role to be involved. So that final element is critical for the department having standing to kind of provide services.
But you're not selling $2,000 worth of those tomatoes, so the commercial farmer. will-
Right, so, you know,
And it says farm products, indicating that you're commercially likely.
Where I see the question is more in line, it seems very clear about like a water test result, I think, and how that might correlate to ability to sell products. I feel like if you just have because there's no, as you kind of address in the second bullet point about produce, because there's really just beginning to have findings on like, if you have X amount in your soil, then you can expect these crops are gonna be at these levels, probably similar to, I guess I would say there is a lot more data related to like probably like animal feed, but like with produce, cause like there's no actual thresholds right now. So like if you had any PFAS in your soil and you didn't have, if you had any nominal amount of it in your soil and you didn't have any farm products that tested at unsafe levels, you would qualify still for this. So I'm just trying to figure out where that line, you know, I think there's like the long term and then there's the interim. There's no we don't have data. It's like we don't have there's so much data that we're lacking, right? I'm just kind of curious how that plays into.
and to date, the department has been flexible and will continue to be so.
Yeah.
But in terms of, you know, building out these programs, I do think it's important to have a definition of who's in it, who's out.
When you talk about the definition of commercial farmer and the threshold is $2,000 worth of sales, assuming that's gross sales.
Yes.
And that's the definition that's used when we talk about the open space farming designation for tax purposes. Does that threshold feel appropriate for folks? For commercial operation in 2023?
Feels like a tiny gross income I have. Maybe that's not a popular opinion, but that seems very small to be considered a commercial farmer. Because sometimes I think, is it like I derive the majority of my income through agriculture. I think it's like one of the USDA's lines, right? Like that language seems more appropriate than a dollar amount.
I think the challenge here too is there's no supports for someone that might be having a meaningful, like that $2,000 or somewhere, you know, somewhere in that lower range. Even though it's nominal, it's probably not, it's probably a small income. Is that their ability to keep maintaining that land as in agriculture? I don't know, like I'm trying to think about like $2,000 of.
Tom,
Like,
can
what
you
does that
mute
equate
Larry?
to, like, say you were, because this does cover someone that's like leasing land or renting land or something, and so like if they get
Yeah, speaking.
Right? So, so say you rented a certain amount of land to another farmer.
Is the lease a farm product?
Yeah, I don't know, I guess. we can figure out how that
Date of
all
birth,
shapes.
6/24/1945.
That would be the case, right, Phil? I mean,
Larry, can you mute your microphone?
04401.
significant amount of land. So he wouldn't qualify if there was contamination on the property.
Because it's not
I'm
his.
sorry, say it again, please.
Well, it's, we pay him the
Larry, can you
lease.
mute your microphone?
Yeah,
Farming, the farm product.
Please
is-
Zoom.
Okay.
is my income, right, so.
In current use, your landlord isn't producing an agricultural product by leasing you agricultural land.
Right,
So he's not making an agricultural income or she,
right,
so they wouldn't meet that threshold.
that's right.
That's the-
That wouldn't qualify, yeah.
Yeah, so we have the definition of farm product up here now, so a lease would not be a farm product.
And to Jim's point about that being a smaller amount, I wasn't even gonna say it first, so. But I will say this, when you talk about a percentage of income, I get nervous about that because almost so many have off-farm jobs. And if you have a spouse or a partner who is pulling 3 shifts a week at the hospital, the majority of your income is coming from that possibly. So we wouldn't want them, that doesn't mean that they're not producing food that consumers are depending upon and communities are depending upon, and that is the whole point. So it is a balance. If through surveys, I mean, from what the state of Maine and the government understands here in the state of Maine through food production, do they feel that 2000 represents a benchmark, or they did in 1957?
Great question. I feel like we should bring that back to the department.
Yeah, I can do some research and.
I mean, the point isn't to exclude somebody, but the point is to make sure that we are including the people that are pertinent to the community that's being fed, correct?
Yeah, yeah.
Not that those other people are not pertinent, please don't say that I said that.
Yeah, just a question, clarification question. Now, that definition, are we basically saying any money from this fund has to meet that definition? It's basically how everything reads, because we were talking in the subcommittee about landlord tenants and like people that might be leasing land that's contaminated and they lose the opportunity to lease that land. So ultimately, are they, even though we were kind of recommending that they got the income replacement money, are we ultimately saying that, well, they actually don't qualify?
There's somewhere where we need to include the term landowner.
Yeah, we kind of brought up the example of talking about like, there's so much land. There's a lot of people that have land that they're leasing out to other farmers to grow, and that might be a small amount of their income, but it's keeping that land in open space, or in theory, right? But like they're losing the farmer might be able to go hopefully find some leases elsewhere, but that person that's left with the land, they aren't going to qualify for these programs. And is that just going to motivate them to go and lease it to somebody else and continue contaminating our food supply? Or is like, what's going to happen to that?
Right. A lack of remediation will.
Hello,
I think it was a hay farmer that was at the public hearing,
okay, yourself?
the Southern Maine, and I think his issue was just this, is that he's gonna lose portions of his land. He doesn't have an alternative because of where he's landlocked, and he only owns 17 acres, I think he said, and the hundreds of acres he pays is on lease. In that case, 1 year of income replacement, he might, the landlord.
How do we handle himself?
Seems like it leaves a gap.
Oh, okay.
And I bet the Southern Maine landowners are more financially invested than probably some land.
Chris, we can hear you.
Tax laws and.
Yeah. Yeah.
Tom, will you please go back to the definition? Keep going. One more. Okay, thanks. So
Oh.
adding in commercial farmers and landowners. Agricultural landowners.
I would,
Oh, Lizzie.
I would definitely specify that it's agricultural landowners or.
Landlords.
Oh, no.
Right.
How about their farmland? Was that a defined term? So would it be like farmland owners?
Exactly.
Farmers,
Wow,
farmland owners.
it's the last, you wouldn't expect it. Huh?
Yeah, so this definition of farmland, that's where the $2,000 per year gross farming income comes from. As well as 5 contiguous acres, and we had some discussion
Yeah.
with the
Who takes-
financial
like
business
cardiology?
committee that maybe we weren't wed to the 5 acres.
I think you might not want to be wed to the 5 acres.
Yeah.
Because I think of a 2-acre lettuce farmer who's probably making more money than
Are
I
these
am.
doctors like that work for the
It's like-
hospital or are they just
Pumping
doctors?
leafy greens out of the, you know, like that would be the
They're not doctors who
sort of
know.
scenario on that 1 to 2 acre lot.
The leafy greens are way more apt to have PFAS issues.
Right, so it's like, you know, I think the 5 acres might cut a significant portion of farmers out of the state
Right.
out.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Tom, can you hear me?
I feel
Or Beth?
like the landowner thing, we need to revisit that, like it might be a separate thing from
Yeah, yeah.
from all of this, if there's. I'm thinking about the, like that gentleman from the, like, he owns 12 acres and he leases 850 acres, he
Oh, you're not
can't.
staying at his place.
From, presumably less than 850 people, but I mean, even our farm
Okay.
lease from dozens and dozens of
Yeah.
people, but I don't know if all of them, I don't
Did it work there?
know if necessarily they would be under the umbrella of this entire program.
Oh,
Does that make sense?
yeah.
And I don't mean to exclude them, but maybe
Do you have a
to
partner there or?
make sure they're in a special category.
I like the same category. I think about that $2,000 limit and I think about where that category, are they in the same vein of? I guess I'm trying to think about people that aren't gonna
Does it work
fall within
then?
that $2,000 limit that might impact their life significantly in some other way, but I don't know.
But I'm also wondering if people under that 2,000 and if are they ineligible for other programs that would fall under
Right.
residents? That's the thing is we
Yeah,
want to be a
they
safety
don't
net,
change the
but
thought.
we want to make sure there is a safety net for them. So maybe there is a safety net. And we should, not yet. So. But I'm thinking like people we've rented land on from in like Fairfield area, there is for osmosis, they've had those things come in and water, and for some reason they don't want city water, but whatever. But things like that. So I'm wondering.
So why don't I try to craft something that takes into account commercial farmers, farmland owners, not wed to 5 contiguous acres, a water test and or a soil test and or a farm product threshold. And I'll share that with the advisory committee via email. And
What do we do about that farmer that's in between? Like I live on a sledge site,
Mhm.
and then you have to wait 6 weeks. There's this moment of, I was like, that's the panic we were in,
Right. And Senator Brenner, I think in that interim period is when the emergency relief fund is able to step in. And
Right.
then the department presently does not step in until we get the food product results.
I think ultimately the goal is that testing window is going to shrink, hopefully, once we finish standing up the different labs around the state.
It would be helpful if the fund paid for expedited service too, which I was told specifically was not available. But like doesn't exist, but it actually does exist. It just costs $300. So in the meantime, you're gonna spend thousands supporting me, and instead of paying $300 just to rush a test. So and that MOFCA and MFT fund won't be there forever. I'm not sure are they gonna keep fundraising hundreds of thousands of dollars annually, knowing that the 60 million is set up? So let's say in 3 years, if that vacates, then you have farmers that will be in this area of waiting.
I also did want to flag, like, how comfortable are we as a state ultimately relying on the good efforts of like these two nonprofits to help, and then all the people that have donated to that fund to kind of lean on that, like as part of our plan. I think it's been a huge safety net for farms initially, but like, I don't personally feel comfortable building that into a state plan unless we are building in like support. Like, I think about those organizations. Yes, there's that fund, but they're paying for staff to manage that fund. And like, we are as a state are leaning on those organizations to almost like building that into the programming. Doesn't feel like a equitable dynamic. It's saved so many, farms in bad situations right off the bat. But I don't think, like, if this continues to, we don't know what this is going to be like in 5 years, but we're building this fund and like planning to support farms. And that's this whole thing, which could be really be like building in an expectation that these nonprofits are gonna be there to be that part of it without.
And as we apply to the program, there's still a window between application and financial recovery. So you could be 10 weeks just hanging out, waiting on things, between a water test result that finally came in, then receiving an application, sending the application in, then hearing back and going back and forth a few times. And then, there's a void.
Can I, Commissioner, ask you a question about timing for moving through the map and what you project would be the time frame for when we might have done a relatively holistic evaluation of farms that have had historic sludge spreading?
So I believe the legislative deadline for us to complete is December 2025, I think. And so that's our target.
So then in theory, by December of 2025, we would have done this full evaluation of Maine's farmland that has historic sludge applications. There's going to be outliers that we don't have a license for, and feed was brought in, or whatever the particular scenario is. So, and then there will be levels that change over time. And so if we are to receive levels from the FDA that are more stringent than what we set up as a state, we may have to shift what we're doing, and then our research efforts are going to provide us additional information. So in theory, we're not producing a program that has to manage the period of time you're talking about for too long, right? Because we're going to get through this sort of wave of discovery. So we need an interim plan for how to support people in that window of discovery, that time period.
And you think MFT and MOFCA and all the good efforts there will bring us to that time?
I don't want to speak to what they're willing to do or what they're capable of. Yeah, I think the state has a role to play there.
Okay, cool, thank you.
Yeah, and I think that's something to discuss further with the Finance and Business Support Subcommittee.
Yeah,
that gray area is.
I just do want to say that they brought up very important points, and I think that a public-private partnership is very beneficial to everybody, but it should definitely not be an assumption. And I think it works in well with the request for actual people to be positions within the department. So.
While you're working on editing the definition of impacted farmer, I wouldn't cite 20 parts per trillion directly. I would say that exceeds either state or federally enforceable drinking water standards. And then in terms of soils, what Adrian had said earlier, Just wanted to note that we did a background soil study across Maine a year or two ago. And we do measure PFAS pretty much everywhere in soils. So even in places where there's no identifiable source. So, if just finding the presence of PFAS in soils was going to be a threshold, then everybody would cross it.
Do you receive information, like when we turned in soil sample or, well, this department did soil sampling and all, do you receive those tests from us? Like, do you know what we're,
No,
I'm curious, like, how much info do you get from the people
How
that
much do you
aren't
know?
coming? When do you show up? No,
Right.
like, when I submit that, while I'm not a spread site, it's still valuable information to you, so how much do you know?
Yeah,
You know,
so what, the data that DEP has that we collect is public.
Right.
And so part of the arrangement that we have with Department of Agriculture is that there is some data that we don't receive in the same format as what we would make public. And so Department of Agriculture receives some data that they may confer with us about. And so we might talk about whether or not there's some additional sampling that then maybe we should go out and talk to you about doing, but we don't see all of it. And sometimes maybe that's better.
yeah, it is better. Thank you. Sorry.
Like I said, I'll craft something that hopefully encompasses this conversation. And share that with you, but also it may, whatever I propose to the advisory committee, I will also share with the subcommittees. And from their perspective, focused on their particular issues, like, somebody who leases out his or her land, or, access to blood testing. Do we need definitions for access to different types of programs? I don't want to have too many definitions because then it's just unwieldy and creates confusion. But also it needs to be relevant to the type of services being offered. So anything further, any of the Zoom folks want to weigh in on this discussion of definitions?
There aren't any hands up currently. Anybody on Zoom have any comments about our definitions that are part of the committee that have any questions or comments about the definition of commercial farmer? Okay, nothing.
So
I think
let's
you're on the right track.
Subcommittees, and I'll ask financial to go first. Adrian Lee is co-chair. This.
I'm just waiting, Beth's gonna pull up something I sent her.
Okay.
No, not supposed to maneuver, thank you.
No, there's notes everyone's.
Been warm up.
I'm gonna try.
Thank you so much.
It might not let me do it.
We are screen sharing with the Zoom audience.
Okay.
It's not showing up here.
Nope, locked out.
Where are those Marine folks? Yeah, warm us up and help our tech.
Center.
Almost feels like the AC is on.
It's on auto cool.
Excellent, it's February.
And it's a new enough room. They hide the sensors from us so that we can't put water on them and trigger. So paper towel works really good for that.
The things you learned from TV.
Yep.
That was a financial and business. support.
Bag of frozen peas on it. It sets off an alarm. Because it indicates that there's been a malfunction, but if you just have a wet paper towel, it causes the cooling to happen slowly enough that it doesn't trip on the sensors.
There's not a website. Ask the state.
Right? For the wet paper towel.
I'm just curious how somebody figured that out. Like,
We're DEP.
Yeah, and Deering, they're all behind lock and key, so.
Oh, yeah.
You guys have the wet paper towel option.
Yeah, I'm sure our new building won't have it either. It's an old building.
I don't know how well we're gonna be able to read this here, but I just kind of put together a quick little sheet on, should I just start even going nuts?
yeah, and just let Tom know where you want to scroll.
Yeah, just, well, this first part just kind of goes over. So we've, our subcommittees met twice at this point. For basically, it seems like on like a two-week schedule, you know, Zoom and in person. The mission of our subcommittee is develop, analyze, and recommend strategies to the PFAS Advisory Committee for short and long-term financial and planning assistance for farmers impacted by PFAS contamination. We have a pretty big scope to this group. I know every subcommittee has a pretty large scope, but there's quite a few, what I'd say, meaty components to this subcommittee to tackle. And you can also see the list here of members. We have a mixture of, you know, staff from DACF, nonprofits, farmers, financial advisors. We got, yeah, loan officers, FSA, MOFGA, MFT in the group, as well as some potential people that might come in for specific key asks as we're making discussions. You can scroll to the next, second page. This kind of goes over some of those topics that we're starting to cover. We've had 2 meetings and we've pretty much, most of our focus at this point has actually been on the income replacement program. This isn't, is there a way to make this big? I don't know if it's a way to make it a little bit bigger or people, I guess I can read it. I don't know, you guys are all closer to the screen than I am, but this is kind of an overview of what we're focusing on. The topics that we're going to probably be able to tackle hopefully this spring are income replacement program, talking about how to pull together a roster of experts to support farmers in this, kind of like basically trying to think about the what can we accomplish right off the bat that will help farmers most immediately, which is kind of where it seems like the group decided to start, even though there's some much longer term needs of support that we're going to need to tackle too. Talking about having potential for like more like caseworker support for impacted farmers, talking about operational payments, loan guarantees, infrastructure projects over 150,000, which is kind of the limit that it sounds like DACF wants to maybe potentially hold management of infrastructure projects below that number. What we are suggesting is that we recommend that we continue to, that we implement the program that, I always get this acronym wrong, BAFRR or DACF. I actually don't 100% understand the difference between that and DACF, and that might just be my own, like.
Sure. So DACF is the agency, the whole Department of Agriculture, Conservation and Forestry, and there are at least 4 bureaus. So Bureau of Agriculture and Rural Resources, they're the ag folks, and there's parks and public lands,
Yeah.
and I'm not getting the names right, I'm sorry, colleagues.
Forestry,
Forestry,
and then resource information and land use planning.
So those are all within that. Well, basically, there's the current income replacement program. We're suggesting to basically adopt that, but extend it for it to be up to 2 years. Some of the key aspects, I just kind of put in here kind of some of the key aspects of what that program is. You can just scroll down a little bit if you want. As far as what this program is looking like, the goal is to replace income, I don't know how to do this. Yeah, basically, it's supporting the farms in the immediate and up to 2 years. The amount is based off of either the prior year or the average of 3 years, the highest gross income levels. To qualify, it will be based off of like documented losses from profit and loss statements. Some things that we flagged in our subcommittee meetings is just a really need for clear communication to farmers about the timeline from when they apply to when they can expect a determination or support. Talking about coordinating with MOFCA and MFT. I think some things we also flagged was just like, if someone comes into this program, need for assurances that folks that are receiving this income replacement are taking products off the market, like the ones that made them qualify for this program. And then there is this question that now sounds like we have to discuss further, is this concept of both leases and leaseors of impacted crops to be eligible, and that's, I guess, a bigger question now, right? As far as if they even qualify for any of the fund. So that's a bigger thing, but these are just things that we've been discussing. We talked about who would benefit and if there would be any folks that be disadvantaged from this program. I guess what we're really asking the greater committee is to ultimately accept our recommendation to adopt this current income replacement program with the addition of it extending up to 2 years, because currently it's only a 1-year program. And I don't know if I was gonna stop there. Are we like voting? Are we voting on stuff?
voting.
Or how did that?
Not a formal vote, but no feedback
Yeah.
from the broader committee. For each of the subcommittees as we
Yeah.
get to them. Are we on the right track? Are there things maybe we've overlooked? Just or affirmation that we are on the right track.
Yeah, maybe if there's any questions or, yeah, like you're saying right now, should be anyone in the Zoom audience has questions.
So if that was adopted, then is there any estimate on the total that would be needed?
We were in our last meeting trying to pull together some rough numbers for a budget. And our current recommendation, have we finalized that enough to?
You can share it.
Yeah, I think we kind of our current thinking currently is like somewhere between $2 and $5 million is where we landed annually for the income replacement program. Through talking to Nancy, the expectation is within the first year of this program through DACF being implemented, it's looking like they'll have spent about $1 million in that first year. With the understanding, depending on the size of farms that are impacted, that number could balloon up a lot. So I think the preference is to hedge our bets and be safe, especially in these next few years. I could see that growing. Kind of a number we definitely debated for a while where to go. I think that's where we currently, I don't know if you guys on the committee have any other.
It was the same,
Yeah.
about the same amount of money, and I think you had made the point that like one dairy farm that's grossing like $2 million a year could deplete a fund in no time, and 2 million is not a lot of money. I think we had an example that day of a farmer there that was like grossing $1 million, and they're not massive. They're not a massive farm, so
Yeah.
I think we're leaning above, closer to 5 than 2.
I think it was like 9 farms. But they expect to spend about $1 million and from like the first like 9 farms that are kind of going through the program. I think. So obviously there's a lot of variation on how much each of those farms is getting depending on size, but if you extrapolate out how much, what we would potentially need, that this seemed.
We did discuss that. Well, it was mentioned, using the worst case scenario as a guidepost wasn't necessarily the best thing, but it's good to be mindful of it. So.
And a note about budget, each of the subcommittees coming up with strategies for income replacement infrastructure and so on, and putting together preliminary proposals. And then when this committee, the full advisory committee comes back together in May, we will have all of those proposed budgets and we'll be able to make some decisions. Are we on the mark? Does something need to be trimmed? Could we add more to another pot? But we need to have all the preliminary strategies thought through before we can look at the overall budget.
I have a couple of just, 2 things. One, on the recommendation to set a time limit on applications related to time after discovery. What was the thinking there?
Yeah, I think we were kind of trying to figure that out exactly. I mean, I don't know if you guys have any feedback on that, but.
I think we wanted to be encouraging that there's a program and we didn't want someone to wait a year after or 2 years or a certain amount of time after because it became apparent they needed help, but we wanted earlier intervention, not simply to help the farmer and the environment, but also if there are food products. It's just trying to be, I think that's where we were on that. It was all about
getting into the program and keeping the food system safe versus someone understandably potentially stressed out about their marketplace. So holding out until a certain point in time, it's never going to be, ultimately, it's never convenient to find out that you have contamination. And so trying to motivate people to help pull those products and be part of the program, especially since there's a lot of crops right now that don't have thresholds. So, yeah.
And then farmers who walk away from farming receive the greatest benefit.
Well, it's not saying they receive the greatest benefit from PFAS contamination. It's more like they get the full lump sum in comparison to if you continue on your farm, you might have still some product that you can keep selling. When you're within this program, if it's looking at the gross sales from the year before or the average, any income that you make from your farm in that current year is going to ultimately be deducted from that prior year to determine how much money you're going to get from a program. And so the explanation here is just more like if you completely walk away, you're going to get the full lump sum of a year's production. Whereas if you keep farming and you have some enterprises in your farm that are not affected, it's not like you're still going to get the full gross income replacement. I think that's kind of what we were.
Is that a desired incentive structure?
Not in my opinion.
I don't know if there's like a way. I think we weren't necessarily. I think we were trying to vocalize just like the realities of the system, not necessarily. I don't see how you. I don't know. Do you guys see another way?
It's not the desired outcome. I don't
It's
think.
not like, oh, this is the best benefit. Like it's more like, I mean, ultimately those people need. They're going to have to make a major change in their life, and the impact of this is going to be a much more major component of like them being able to move forward compared to a farm that might be able to continue production and think about switching crops or switching feed. And so ultimately, I think that, I think the idea of the group was that like, that's just like the nature, we're just kind of trying to identify the nature of a program like this, but ultimately.
Just all cards on the table.
Yeah.
This is, looking at what was, how equitable it is and who will benefit and just really clear looking and being honest. It's monetarily, that's true. It's doesn't mean like the ethos is true.
Yeah, and I think.
Maybe the word benefit is the
Benefit,
is
so
the
yeah,
wrong
that's-
word you're
yeah.
using, and most people might be more like, will receive the greatest income replacement.
That's the
Because it's really the worst benefit
Yeah,
at the
and
end of the day.
And I think that one thing that we talked about a lot in the group was, whereas currently there's not too many tools in the toolbox yet to support farms through DACF, or there's the intention for that, but we haven't implemented them yet. The hope is that income replacement, if a farm is entering into discovery of PFAS now, that we're also having this income replacement will be like part of a suite of supports. And if you are a farmer that can no longer keep farming, you're probably not going to you're not going to benefit from a lot of those other supports, whereas this is like one avenue that you're going to benefit, if you can call it a benefit. It's people's whole livelihoods and lifestyles are disrupted. And so like, I think that's not really, I think the word benefit is basically like you're saying, we should just address that wording there for sure.
So is the idea that the suite of supports would include immediate income replacement, maybe potential with pivoting your business?
Yeah, like this is like, we could scroll down a little bit. We haven't really, as you can imagine, just from like the conversation we had today, all the stuff is so like, there's so many nuances to all of this. Like we've had 2 meetings and we pretty much just had a time to go through like one of
We didn't get to like operational support
Yeah.
and things like that, which, I think everybody is hoping that we get to a point where the emergent need and the income replacement becomes like just a brief thing. It isn't going to take up a whole year because we've reached research and data and mitigation and we're able to jump to the next things. I think that's what we're all in the back of our head looking at.
Yeah. And so like, say you, like when we're talking about other supports, like loan guarantees, having like currently there are 3 staff members that DACF has that are kind of working as, I would argue that they're not really working as what I would define as a caseworker. They're working to like help. They're in the role that we're kind of maybe discussing. It's not as comprehensive as a caseworker, I would say. They're more like program field techs. And that's a big difference between like somebody that would be maybe more like a caseworker support system for a farmer. Making sure that we have like a roster of experts or people, technical service providers, trying to flesh out the concept of that program, talking about operational payments. I just put in your animal fee because that was like one thing that's been brought up, but there's obviously a variety of ways to kind of look at that. And then I think it's gonna take us a while to even get to the infrastructure project component of discussion, I feel like, but working through, these are the things that we're basically trying to start working through. Like I was saying, we have decided to meet like twice a month, basically, right? I think is where we're at right now, you guys. So, because like, there's just so much to cover. We briefly had time to talk about just the need for potential loan guarantees for farmers, or just ensuring that farms, if they are pivoting or trying to maintain their business operations, with discovery, their options for loans might be pretty limited, and that might in itself limit potential to rebound. So and that was just like kind of like seems like almost like an easy low-hanging fruit thing to talk about compared to some of the other things that we have to talk about as a group. So I don't know if you guys want to add anything else to talk about like our discussion the past 2 times.
I just wanted to pin with that discussion of the position, when we discussed it, a position at DACF. That could possibly be a recommended legislation that is on the agenda later. I don't know why I said later. Never ever spoken. Later.
So I'd like to welcome Representative Hall to the meeting.
Thank you. My apologies for being late. The committee this morning ran way over time, so.
So we're just getting updates from the various subcommittees, starting with financial and business support.
I think so. I don't know if there's anything else that wants to add. But or if there's questions online at all, that sound like it.
Anybody online who's a part of the committee have any questions? Good, thank you. Thanks, you guys.
I think we'll do land next. Alex, do you want to present that?
Sure.
You could do like, if you're getting out of farming, they'll replace 100% of your income. But if you're staying in farming, they'll calculate it based on 110% of your income. There could be some way to incentivize staying in production by making that calculation run more than your income. But I don't know how that would actually work. Tom's good at this now. All set?
Not quite.
Okay.
Share the screen.
Mr. Hall, just so you know, they did pay the heating bill, it's just not working.
Yeah, well, it's not a lot more heat over in the cross building either, so I'm not sure what's going on.
Alex, it's land transfer.
Yep. Yep, this is the right slideshow.
Share that. Okay, that's being shared. Yep, all good.
Okay, hi, everybody. My name's Alex Redfield. I've worked for the Bureau of Agriculture, Food and Rural Resources at DACF. And along with Sherry Hamill, who is the State Executive Director for the FSA and is on Zoom. We're co-chairing the Land Transfer Subcommittee, talking about the state's acquisition of contaminated farmland. We met once so far, and after this next meeting at the end of the month, we're also moving to a twice a month schedule because there's a lot to do. So I'm happy to, Sherry did all the work. I'm not gonna pretend to take credit in this slideshow, but we're happy to sort of bring you up to speed with the initial conversation and would welcome feedback on the program as it evolves. That's who's on the committee. As you see, similar to the financial and income replacement subcommittee, sort of mix of state agency staff, service providers, some expertise in real estate transactions, specifically around ag, real estate, and farmers. Conservation easement expertise with Sarah from Land for Maine's Future and Brett from NFT. Let's just keep rolling. We don't need to spend much time here either. We took the guidance from your committee to think through how purchase and sale or on sale and holding of agricultural land contaminated with PFAS might look, and what the process would be and what the eligibility would look like. We have not started talking about what relocation would look like, and based on the testimony at the Ag Committee this morning, relocation is a totally different beast than buying and selling agricultural land, and I'm very intimidated by tackling item number C, but we'll see how it goes. Yeah, next slide, I think. So we started by thinking through, if the state is going to have a program to buy land that's contaminated with PFAS, what's it going to look like? And these are the questions that we're working through sort of one at a time. You could essentially distill this as eligibility. Who would we buy the land from? At what price? What will happen to the land after it's acquired? And what are the alternative programs that might be offered in conjunction with this, recognizing that land buyout is not a solution that a lot of farmers may be interested in. And so are there alternatives? The one that we talked about, which I don't think is in the slides, but could be modeled after the Farm Service Agency's CRP program, the Conservation Reserve Program, essentially paying farmers to use their land in a particular way that meets other objectives. As an alternative to a buyout, but that's we don't even have one program figured out, so don't have much detail on that yet. Yeah, next slide. We started by orienting ourselves with some presentations from Nick Hodgkins at DEP on the VRAP program, which I guarantee I'm not the most qualified person in the room to talk about, but is a mechanism by which the DEP can support municipalities and communities that are interested in cleaning up contaminated land by waiving some of the rights that DEP typically has and enforcement tools that DEP typically has in exchange for some guarantees on how that property is used moving forward. Deed covenants sort of restricting how the land is utilized in the future. And a presentation by Brett at MFT on if and how easements could play into the picture. A separate question that we haven't really tackled is, let's say the state does buy a contaminated piece of farmland, would an easement on that property make sense? And if so, what are the mechanisms by which that would be placed on that land, and what would the restrictions on that easement look like? So a lot of detail. That's the theme of my presentation, is a lot of detail yet to figure out. Yeah, next slide thing. Great. So the sort of format of our conversation will eventually get to trying to flesh out answers to each one of these questions. We talked a lot about, let's say there's a 1,000-acre dairy farm that spread sludge on 20 acres of land. Should the entire farm be eligible for a buyout, or would 20 acres be eligible for a buyout? And what are the pros and cons of that? I think that is the question that we sort of settled on, that splitting up a farm has tangible negative impacts on the value of that farm in the future. And so a blanket rule that would only purchase contaminated land probably doesn't make sense, and that there will need to be some nuance and review by a panel of human beings to analyze each situation as it comes in and try to make an informed decision rather than a uniform agreement to only purchase contaminated land or only purchase an entire parcel. Yeah, is it helpful to talk through each one of these questions, or is that a level of detail that I'm happy to welcome? Yeah, obviously I welcome feedback, and Sherry does, and other members of this committee. Adam is also on the committee, would certainly welcome conversations outside of this session to sort of gauge feedback on particular questions here. Yeah, I mean, big picture is we're trying to think of what a program would look like. Each one of those steps is really complicated. And if you only make $2,000, are you eligible for a $2 million buyout from the state? Probably not. So there needs to be some other level of eligibility and some other framework by which each application is accepted. And I'm excited to have a draft that you guys can chew on, but that's always the way.
When you discussed, will anyone be disadvantaged? Did you come up with anyone in particular in that discussion, or?
Haven't even touched that question yet.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it's in people will. Yeah, I mean, certainly.
That was a good enough answer.
Okay, great.
I accept that
I
answer.
imagine people will be disadvantaged.
Should we tap Sherry
Oh, yeah.
and see if she has any,
Great.
anything that she wants to embellish or add, or?
Hi there. No, thank you, Alex, for going over the slides. I think you hit all the points I was going to mention. I think we're just really, like Alex said, there's a lot of moving parts here. So, looking for feedback, comments, thoughts on, some of these questions. Alex mentioned the CRP program for FSA, and it could be an option. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
I know it's echoing back really bad on my end. It's not. FSA is still working through our environmental process and what we are going to be able to do or not do. So we don't have any good answer to that. But I will keep you posted when things, things change on our end.
Even you're working, Tom, but there is one more slide too.
Sorry, Sherry, for the terrible feedback.
Were you able to hear anything?
Yes, and we're
Okay.
grateful for your work. Thank you.
You're welcome.
I can just run through it because some of the questions that are in this last slide of additional comments are certainly topics that are getting some attention. We agreed that we need to, whatever the mechanism is by which the price for a farm is determined, it needs to look at the value of the land without contamination. We need to allow seller flexibility in determining the extent of a property that's up for sale. If a house is on a property and someone doesn't want to leave their house, but they want to sell off their contaminated farmland, that should definitely be opportunity or possibility. And it's going to be a really fine line to walk between transparency and flexibility, and wanting to allow for different situations to be accommodated and do right by each applicant to a potential program, and to have super clear criteria and scoring mechanisms and processes that the public can see how decisions are reached, because this could potentially be the outlay of a huge amount of money, depending on the size of the property and the location. So it's pretty much what we talked about. Happy to dig into a point or move on, whatever you prefer.
So I was wondering if you had any discussion on the farmer disposes of their farm, the state, right? But they're also giving up 3 decades of income. You know, and often the farm is the equity that the farmer has to make income in their retirement or pass on to other generations and stuff. So do we have to consider that they're losing not just the equity of the land and the amount of land, or that their land has decreased in value at a certain time and stuff, that they may have paid a mortgage for 29 years. And here we are, but we may not be compensating them fully for everything they're going to lose out of that situation.
Benefit, like their improvement, like how do you quantify the improvements that any farm, all the sweat, all the sweat equity, all the,
So as a clarifier, that's what you're sort of saying is what's the difference between the land value and the business value? Because all of a sudden they also have neither.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, conventional wisdom from the appraiser expertise perspective that we had was defining the business income is very hard. And that 2 different appraisers with the exact same information could come up with pretty dramatically different conclusions on the value of the business. And that real estate and infrastructure, there are comparative sales that you can generate a fair market value from, but business income has this whole other mechanism of valuation, which is just a lot more ambiguous. Not that it shouldn't be included, but maybe that's where the income replacement program is sort of some of the numbers that are generated from the analysis of the business there could be a way to replace that revenue without trying to get a fair market value determination on a business itself.
Because we're asking the farmer to change their profession, you know, like completely abandon what they're doing here, walk onto something else and possibly have to change a profession. And there's value in that beyond the land itself. So maybe it doesn't fall in this committee, it falls somewhere else.
not to add more to our committee's work, but it does seem to me through this conversation that we should make sure that there's like language built into some of the sports and the financial business support community that is also tied to what I would say is like, I know you haven't gotten to land to like helping to relocate a farm, but there's a huge amount, like when I think about how can this committee, can this money, I mean, because it is so, like you're saying, it's so unwieldy number, but can any of this financial support be able to be startup seed money to help a farmer bounce back to where they were? I think about how like, and it's such a slow process in the past 15 years of our farm, like all these small little incremental changes do make sense. I don't have another 15 years of my life to put into that. And so like to financially get someone to the point where they can hopefully get close. They won't be able to get to exactly where they were because that's just the nature of the beast of this kind of situation. But like, what can we do to support that transition if someone does sell their property and is actually trying to start in another place? Like what?
How would it be to move all of your cows somewhere? Like an expense you could never shoulder.
Yeah, and I mean, I like the idea of including that in there, sort of like if a mill shuts down, there's an action plan to help retrain, rehouse, reevaluate and retrain. So, but to your point about that value that isn't necessarily land, but land is so tied to how much wealth a farmer has. Anyone who wants to complain about farmers having too much wealth, even if their profit loss sheet looks like crap, they'll say, well, they own all of this. So if they just disposed of some of it, they would be sitting pretty, which doesn't really solve the problem of farming, but it's a huge amount of money. I don't know. I think they have to just say it's the land. We can never replace someone's.
It's very hard to, because you got the whole infrastructure of everything. It takes the whole picture to make the thing work. It isn't just the land. It isn't just the buildings. It isn't just the equipment. Like you can move equipment, you don't move buildings, you don't move the land. So I mean, it's the whole mechanism.
I think to your point, Alex, about there needing to be a group of humans that evaluate each transaction with some guardrails and parameters is pretty crucial. Because everyone is going to be different. And same with the business supports, everyone is going to be different. There's no like cookie cutter PFAS impacted farm.
Nobody wants to be making that application. No one wants to be there.
Exactly, yeah. Which is where I think your idea that you guys came up with the case manager is really a valuable idea.
Looking for a sponsor.
I'm gonna just throw the idea out there of maybe a 10-minute break. And then we can do our last two. Yeah, your research and health monitoring. Right, okay, that sound good? Yeah. So that would be 2:51. Let's make it 2:50, 9 minutes. Okay, great. We can hear you. Want to have a go at giving your presentation?
Yep.
Okay. Are you presently a co-host?
Can you see my screen? Can you see that?
Yes.
Oh, good. Okay. Everybody will recognize this landing slide because I stole it from Beth. So hi, everybody. Again, my name is Becca Bolas, and I am co-chair of the Health Subcommittee with Isaac, who's also on here. And similar to the other presentations, just going to give you a bit of an overview of our scope, who's on our committee, which topics we've been discussing at the meetings that we've had so far. And then we'd love to get some of your feedback on what we've been working on and what we're planning to work on in the coming months. So our mission of our subcommittee is to develop, analyze, and recommend strategies for the provision of blood testing, medical monitoring, and mental health support in the short and long term for individuals whose drinking water or agricultural land is found to be contaminated by PFAS. And this is something that we've been discussing around eligibility, drinking water and agricultural land. I'll talk about that in a moment. And our scope for our subcommittee is to consider recommending strategies related to PFAS blood testing, providing for medical monitoring, and the provision of access to mental health care, as well as a system of peer support. We heard that at our meeting. I think it was in December. There was some discussion about that. I also want to flag that the legislation did allow for the provision of medical care to people with elevated PFAS levels. However, I just as a reminder, we determined that the fund wouldn't pay for medical care for things like cholesterol medication or for cancer treatment, other than the medical monitoring and mental health care that you see here. That doesn't mean it's not something that we'll discuss as a committee in terms of potential recommendations, but that's not something that we're expecting to put forward as a recommended strategy. Also within our scope is consideration of a public health study. So for example, to determine how farmers are exposed or impacted differently than the general public. This is our subcommittee. As I said before, Isaac and I are co-chairs, and I just want to flag that you can see we have a mix here of physicians, including physician researchers who are studying PFAS. We have Adam, who works at both Defend Our Health and as a farm owner. And you can see too, we have a mix of both state and nonprofit representation. So a good mix of different perspectives and expertise. So to date, we've kind of focused on 5 areas, but we've not had very many meetings like the other subcommittees. So we're really just getting going. But we have talked about testing, including the cost of testing, insurance, both underinsured, uninsured, and what insurance will pay for in terms of testing. We've talked about the lab capacity, the role of the state lab, as well as commercial labs. What is the state's lab capacity, and when it when it has more capacity and is able to do this type of testing, will that be enough to meet the potential demand? If not, which is maybe more likely that it wouldn't be, what would it look like to have a commercial agreement or to have an agreement with commercial labs? So just talking about those, different considerations. We've also talked about medical monitoring and what a program would look like. We've discussed having PFAS clinics or centers of excellence, which would be an opportunity for physicians and patients around the state to have a cohort of experts that could provide resources and information to other providers as well as to patients around the state, what a potential public-private partnership would look like. So I'm just giving you kind of a scattering of the different topics that we have discussed, but I want to just underscore we have only had a couple of meetings. So none of these are fully formed, but it is what we've discussed in our meetings. For the medical monitoring, we've looked at, and you all heard the presentation about the National Academy's report. And so we do have some initial guidance from that. It's likely that as more data become available, there may be changes to those recommendations, but we're using that right now for our framework as we consider what a program here might look like. We've talked about eligibility for testing, again, thinking about insurance and when and in what way does the state support testing. There's a lot to think about there. There are some examples of other states. I don't want to say some examples. I know of one example that could serve as a model for us. Maybe there are others, I don't know yet, but we have been looking at that. We've been discussing if test results should be reportable to the state. There are certainly pros and cons to that. We have to consider if that might be a deterrent for people to participate. We don't know if that would be the case. If they are reportable, that would certainly help get a better sense of the scope of contamination and would also provide more information, in other ways to the state. But, just initial conversations about reportability. And as I said before, we did hear feedback from the group that support for mental health and peer support and resources would be very helpful. And so that is on our agenda to discuss, as well as developing some education for healthcare providers, primarily PCPs, but certainly consider other providers as well. And that may be in collaboration with other nonprofits. I work for Maine Public Health Association. We could be supportive of that, as well as Maine Medical Association, Academy of Pediatrics. So other healthcare provider associations as well could be part of that effort. And then the last one is really thinking about our report. One of the things that has come up a few times, and we heard this even in the earlier conversation today, is this funding is intended for a fairly specific audience, but there's certainly other people that are impacted by PFAS contamination. And so one of the hopes that we have as we're preparing these plans is that these could be used for other programming should other funding become available that would support a wider audience. So I just wanted, we as a subcommittee wanted to make it clear to others that that's very much on our mind, and we are aware that there are others that are impacted by this, and our hope would be that whatever program we propose and come up with could also be applied to other populations. So what we're looking for some feedback on from the group is the scope that I discussed about possible funding uses. What you think about if you have any ideas for us to consider on our framework for other potentially impacted populations, and then really anything that I didn't present that you're wondering about, which we may have discussed and maybe I forgot to put in here, or that we haven't discussed yet, and we should include that in our agenda moving forward. So those are my slides. I don't know, Isaac, if you have anything you want to add to that.
Thanks, Becca. I just want to highlight one or two things that you said in particular, which are that we really recognize that what we're starting to develop here in terms of addressing the health needs of people who have been exposed to PFAS is much broader than the populations that we're focused on with the fund. And because we're really doing this work on behalf of the state, and the state will ultimately need to provide guidance about how others who are exposed to PFAS in Maine should proceed. We really want to make sure that we do this in a way that helps to set the framework and helps to start to create that capacity, both in terms of testing and healthcare ability to respond to PFAS exposures for other populations. So it's not something that I think directly impacts or needs additional funding, but it very much affects the way that we think about this. That's all I wanted to share. Thank you all.
Thank you. And that's all I have, Beth. So I don't know if we can open it for discussion or how you want to proceed.
Yeah, there's some questions here in the room. Jenny?
I'm just curious, and this is something I should have asked earlier for other subcommittees as well, but when you use the word farmers, are you also including any farm workers or ag employees that may be on those farms? So is that defined that way, or do we need to make sure it's clear?
That was our intention. We can make it clear in our language.
Well, I don't know if we've made it clear as an advisory.
As a committee. Mm-hmm.
That's a question I've had and I haven't actually sought the answer, so I'm sorry. It wasn't you, it was just general.
We did discuss that though, just so you know, that was part of our discussion, and our intent as a subcommittee, which could differ from what we're allowed to do, but our intent as a subcommittee was to include farm workers.
And I'll also just add, I think we certainly acknowledged as a subcommittee the language from the original statute that includes farmers, their family members who may be in the same households, as well as workers on the farms. And so it is helpful for us to know from the committee if that's not a category that's already defined elsewhere, and that will sort of give us the impetus to offer up a definition of what those terms mean.
Does that make sense? Like, is there a definition?
For farm worker?
Or
You know, Alex? I don't know if the top of my head, but I could research it.
Also just flag that, in addition to a definition of, a particular role, one thing that we want to consider is how much exposure that means. Right. So, for someone who's been working on a farm for years, it's probably pretty straightforward that they meet the definition, but someone who might be, say, a migrant farm worker who has been on that farm for 1 or 2 growing seasons for 1 or 2 years, they would probably also meet that definition, but it's probably something that we need to clarify. A family member who might have limited or no exposure to the agricultural land probably needs a little bit more clarification.
Any other questions in the room? Any questions on the Zoom?
I am just curious if there are any other specific health considerations that that you're wondering about, if we've discussed or we should be discussing.
Adrian?
I guess I had a question related to medical monitoring and the whole discussion around the framework to that. Similar to like probably other impacted communities or just impacted groups, like the recommendations from the Academy of Health like peak out at like, if you've been exposed to, if you have more than like 20 parts per trillion of PFAS in your body, that's like the max at which they like had like their health monitoring recommendations. Whereas people that have been impacted through their water at high levels are going to probably be magnitudes high, significantly higher levels of this in their body. So I guess a question when we are trying to address what medical monitoring means and how the recommendations related to that. I guess I'm curious about the level of like how are you to define medical monitoring and what does that look like as far as what this fund is to support it? Just a blood test each year to make sure that you don't have elevated levels of certain things, or is it a deeper dive into monitoring potential for cancers and others? Like how deep does this committee go? And I think that's a question that I definitely have.
Yeah, thanks for that question. I can say a few things. So first of all, the report from the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine defines really 3 categories of people based on their PFAS blood levels. And without going into the specific numbers, we can sort of categorize those as no to very little exposure, some exposure, and a lot of exposure, or a lot of PFAS in blood. 20 is the threshold between the middle category and the high category. And so we're really considering 2 things in the subcommittee. One is whether our recommendations for health monitoring exceed those of the National Academies. And much of what's in the recommendations from the National Academies includes things that are the normal standard of care that all doctors should be doing, but that don't always actually happen for every patient. And then additional types of screening, such as screening for thyroid disease or other screening for cardiovascular disease, for example. And so one key question that we're addressing is whether there should be any type of health monitoring above the recommendations from the National Academies. And the other question that we're considering is because, as you noted, there are a number of people in Maine who have blood PFAS levels that are much higher than that threshold value of 20. We're also considering the question of whether we should define 1 or more higher categories of exposure that should have their own recommendations. So we're working with some of our clinicians in the community who have a lot of experience working with PFAS exposed communities. We're looking at the literature. At this time, we don't have any specific recommendations, but that's very much something that we're looking to address as the subcommittee. Thank you.
Anyone else? Anyone have a response to Becca's question about other things we ought to be looking at that we didn't look at on the committee? Yeah, Jenny.
Did you discuss, and I'm sorry, everything's becoming a slide blur to me today, about making sure that all healthcare providers are onboarded and communicated with? Was that part of
discussion.
Yeah, Isaac, do you want me to answer this one?
Sure,
Sure.
go for it.
We did talk about creating a provider education program to make sure that providers have access, help primary care providers specifically have access to when to recommend testing, but then also what to follow up with as we discover and monitor their blood serum over the years in terms of other tests, to make sure that things that they will be at risk for, we're looking for. And then mitigation strategies, so making sure they're aware of what mitigation strategies would look like for a particular household.
The other thing that I would, thank you for sharing that. The other thing I would add is that while, you know, we on behalf of the state have a lot of ability to communicate directly with providers across the state, we also recognize that a lot of what we're going to be asking them to do in terms of learning about PFAS exposure and how to care for patients with concerns about PFAS will be new to a lot of providers across the state. And while we will put a lot of energy and effort and resource into clinician education, we're not expecting that all clinicians are just going to turn on a dime and be able to do all of this quickly. And so that's pointed us towards some additional discussions around how we might be able to foster or even fund certain, I'll call them centers of excellence across the state, essentially clinicians who partner with us to be early adopters in places where any patient could go if they don't have a primary care doctor, or if they have a primary care doctor who isn't familiar enough with all of these expectations to know what to do.
But we have started it up.
great.
The IT
Well,
support
sorry.
here.
Have a good day.
Anyone else in the Zoom space? Questions? I think that's probably it for health. Thank you, guys.
Thank you. Thanks, Isaac.
Thank you all.
So let's turn to research now.
Okay, so I'm Diane Rowland and I'm co-leading with Commissioner Beal, the research subcommittee. So the subcommittee's mission is to develop, analyze, and recommend strategies to the PFAS Fund Advisory Committee for short and long-term research that informs management decisions. And the scope is we're making recommendations regarding research priorities, whether and how the fund could support applied research to inform short-term and long-term farm management issues, and the structure of a competitive grant program focused on PFAS-related agricultural research. So our committee contains members from DACF, UMaine, the Flood Brothers, Misty Brook Farm, Maine Public Health, Maine CDC, BEP, MFT, Colby College, Cooperative Extension, the Shaw Institute, Northern Tilt, and MOFGA. So our first meeting really was spent primarily brainstorming topic areas. So trying to determine what are some of the research priority areas that are being considered and would be those priority areas, at least for launching the research subcommittee. So there were a set of those that were developed. And then we moved on to determining a rubric. There were the evaluation metrics where if we did have a competitive grant program, how would they be evaluated with a rubric? The main key to all of those priority areas was making sure that they addressed and were able to inform management decisions across the board. That would be kind of a standard across any of the priorities that were put forward. Our second meeting was spent looking at some of the various forms of what the funding might entail. One was the opportunistic research. So the testing that's already been done by the state and is being done now. How do we collect that together? How do we continue to support that really important work? So would there be a place then for that continued support of the opportunistic research? We went into the competitive grants program, and I guess we were expecting that we would be able to refine that rubric going forward and be able to maybe launch that. Beth, there were some procurement issues. I don't know if you want to talk about those or if those have been dealt with,
More or
but,
less resolved, yeah.
okay.
So the concern was with, the advisory committee is composed of the experts in the state who are familiar with PFAS research related to agriculture. And there was some concern that having the people that may ultimately apply for the funding help in developing the rubric. It looks like we will be able to contract with universities. And we need to obviously sort out the details, but for one possibility would be we contract with UMaine to do some research for the fund, but also part of their responsibility under that contract would be to evaluate other proposals from other institutions.
So we haven't moved as far as we had hoped on that development of that rubric, but I would imagine that will be, since we've worked this out, that'll be a consideration then for our next meeting. Part of what we discussed was this sort of development of research priorities and making sure that that was changeable and agile depending on what comes up and what we learn about. There was a suggestion that perhaps moving forward, we would want to get something on the ground immediately. And so that sort of initial discussion about research priorities probably would stand. But then moving forward, maybe there's this regular meeting at the Ag Trades Show, the public hearing, maybe that particular public hearing would be where there could be a co-creation of those research priorities with farmers, with the public. And so that was put forward as a possible refinement of those research priorities going forward. The other thing that we discussed was a research database. In what we talked about, focused on mainly was studies that had already been done and gathering the research that had already been conducted, and then making sure we had a repository going forward for any of the studies or information or perhaps data sets that could go into a single repository. There was general consensus that it would be great to have that available to the researchers and not so much to the public. But I would say there was a little bit dissension about it should be made public. I was one of those that felt like it should definitely be made public. But maybe how we do that and what that platform would look like could be more complex. But that was definitely a part of the discussion. Charles Rowski of the Shaw Institute, they have a repository for some of the literature that's out there. We have one at the University of Maine. He put forward a proposal maybe that the Shaw Institute could house this database. And so there are, I think, really good options going forward about where this repository might exist and continue to grow, which I think is a really key part of the research efforts. The last thing that was brought up, or it's not the last, but I think one of the things that I wanted to bring forward to the committee in general was a question about the allocation of the funds. So when you look at the typical research experiment, getting the management decisions and having that be supported in a robust way, research is going to be somewhere around $500,000 a year per project. A lot of that is testing, but it's labor, it's all of the materials and supplies. That's not across the board, but I would say that's kind of an average cost. So if we launch 5 to 8 projects, that's a big investment in that research enterprise. And maybe that's the way that it should go, maybe not. One of the suggestions that was put forward that I thought was interesting is maybe we should be looking at an investment of a farm that becomes an experiment station. And there are models in which an experiment station could be certainly run by the state, but it might be run in conjunction with universities as well. And what that would do is give more permanent infrastructure for some of the research that can be conducted over time. And it also allows for projects to get started without having to find equipment, find, all the infrastructure that's needed to set up a trial. This experiment station might have that already set, and that investment might be worth that. I will say, because I'm the director of the experiment station at the university, it's a lot of money to run these experiment stations, but I think it's a really good question. Because again, as a researcher myself previously, getting the funding set to get a trial going and to get that set up it's a lot of investment. So I guess that would be one of the things I would really be interested in having the committee discuss in general. What are the pros and cons to sort of funding these individual projects versus making an investment in infrastructure?
Can I ask you a clarification question on like expenses? So if you're saying like an experiment station would also maybe like more to manage, but are you saying that basically if there was an experiment station and then that like 500, and then you were saying like each project is on average is about $500,000 to run, with that number per, like, so say you would have multiple experiments going or projects going on that research station, would that number go significantly down per project? Like what would be like a timeline on like how could that station almost pay itself, the benefit of having that versus having lots of like projects around the
So
station?
it certainly wouldn't apply to every research project, but I would guess, yes, that those expenses would go down. That, from a university standpoint, that's why we kind of go to that model, because then not everybody's having to arrange for a tractor. They're not having to arrange for labor necessarily, that infrastructure is there on site. So yes, I would expect that would help pretty significantly in the individual project costs. But the other thing I think that was part of the discussion of the group is then that experiment station makes research more accessible to a larger number of groups as well, because you don't have to come in necessarily with that cadre of resources. So, and I think that's been part of the important discussion in my view with how do we make sure that research is available and open to everybody to conduct, or that has justifiable methods, for example, but maybe needs to partner with someone to get it done. I think that's really important that we make it as accessible as possible.
I have a question for you. Do you see utility in the research station model as it may potentially relate to bringing in outside partners, either other state universities from different states or private research groups or projects that, if there's a product development, for example, do you envision that possibility happening with a research station?
I do, and I also think it's a focal area to perhaps attract funding at the federal level.
Okay.
And it's just, it's notoriety, but also it's the notion that you have everything in place to conduct research in a region that is really impacted. You would want to make sure that the connection then out. So I would envision that this would be an affected farm, right? So it's really relevant, but then you're also making those connections out to other farms and making sure that it's applicable. But I do. I would, of course, this is my opinion. So.
Any other questions? Maybe. Anyone on Zoom with any questions for Diane?
I'm sorry, I have one more question.
Yeah, that's great.
Do you have, I know you're talking about like housing this, having there be a repository for information. That to me sounds like a repository for information that might be more applicable to other research projects. Like a key thing for me as an impacted farmer is like, how do I glean as much information to help me make good decisions for our business? And I also even currently know that there's all this testing that all these different farms are doing, all these different products, but like, I don't have any access to any of that data except for my own farm. And so beyond what I would say bigger picture research data from like experiment, like how do we, you know, like, I just want to make sure that if there's funding through this committee going into research, that like we really also tie in like real life ability for like farmers that are trying to make decisions, have really good pathways to access to information, help them make good decisions about their business.
Yeah, and I guess I'm seeing this database, again, this is just my opinion, I'm seeing the database sort of as two separate things. One is access to the data. So the data itself, I think, is going to be important for us to apply, you know, machine learning, AI. It'll make a difference down the road. This one that we've been talking about is really more previous results. And I think in general, the committee was in agreement that it would be not only the reference itself, but there would be some annotation, some explanation about, you know, what is it? What's the main finding of that? How it might apply to main systems, how it might not. I think that's really important to everybody.
Yeah.
That's going to take somebody to do that. And there will be some vetting as far as, so they talked about, you know, setting up a wiki and those sorts of things. There'll be some vetting about who annotates that and knowing the source of that annotation. But I think that's a key for everybody. It would benefit the researchers, and I would imagine that it would benefit farmers too, to sort of have that summary that, so. But I see the need for two databases essentially. And I'm in conversation with some various groups about the data repository itself. And I know the state's working on it too. I think there are some existing data repositories where we wouldn't have to reinvent that and we could layer it on, which I think is awesome. But I think that piece needs to get done too.
I've been really impressed by the model at, for example, like GMRI, the Gulf of Maine Research Institute, where they have sort of partnered this public-private partnership with university folks working within the organization, and the sort of funding model of bringing in different sources of revenue, but then having the university appointments housed at GMRI. Did that come up at all?
It didn't, but those are both my faculty, so I know that relationship really well. So we didn't talk about housing faculty or housing people at the experiment station. So all of our experiment stations through the university don't house people, but I am very familiar with ones where they are truly housed there. So I guess it depends on what site or what the experiment station looks like. I think in general, what captures the general topic of what you're talking about is having it be a partnership, maybe across several different organizations and agencies. And I think that would be very successful. So I didn't answer your question, but.
No, well, just that it's like it's in the thinking space. Just want to throw it out there.
Yeah. And agreed, yeah, GMRI, that relationship is
because in some ways I think it gets to what you're speaking about, which is how do you take raw data, research data, how do you formulate it into ways that's useful for the public? And sometimes there are relationships, I think, out there that can help to deliver that information in really useful ways to farmers. Like I think about MOFCA, or maybe there's the equivalent in the dairy community that's doing education. The potato board might have, maybe potato growers might have another way that they would like to get their information out. But, can we plug researchers into different organizations in ways that help deliver that data? I'd like to have a good ending to my dancing over here on our table. Thank you for that. Anything else? Anyone? think Beth has our last presentation for the day. We're getting there.
Yes, and I apologize, I didn't have slides, but whenever I don't have to do slides, I'm all about it.
So, and this here, the art slides, this is the draft report that I emailed around previously. So this is the report from the advisory committee to two committees of the legislature. And I hope people had a chance to review it. Like I said, it's pretty bare bones. Given that it's approaching 4 o'clock, maybe we can scroll through. The folks on Zoom, can you see it?
Yep, yeah, we
can,
can.
If you would just scroll through slowly, please, and I guess maybe someone shout out if you have a comment. So introduction, what's it all about? Annual reporting requirements, background related to the fund. All of you are listed as advisory committee members. Dates of our meetings, what was discussed. I've since I sent this draft out, I've added more about the work of the individual subcommittees. Talk about the short and long-term goals of the fund broadly. On each of the subcommittees. And then, so my primary question is, for subcommittee members, do you want more detail? At this point, no decisions have been made about recommendations that will be advanced from the subcommittees to this full committee, which is why I erred on the side of being pretty sparse. If anyone feels differently, let me know. And like I said, we have the invitation to submit proposals for legislation. And is that anything we're prepared to do at this point? The report's due March 1. I feel like we're very early in the development stage, but if there are glaring changes that you see a need for now, let me know.
Can I get a clarification on like we were talking about earlier about who qualifies for money through this fund? Is that is like, do we need to put any recommendations towards the legislature to adjust anything at this point? Or is that more internal definition decision-making that we're doing?
I would prefer that this committee and the subcommittees define who is
We don't have
eligible.
to ask permission to change
Right.
that. Okay. Okay.
Yeah. Because the people in this room, the subcommittee members, you've all been giving a lot of thought to this. And we're still a little bit stuck. So, I feel like we've been given the authority to set up this program to really give thorough consideration, and I would like to continue down that path.
We've discussed the idea of a caseworker and of a position at the ACF. Is it too early to ask for that position? Should we wait? Or what is, if we don't ask for it, when would be the next time? And would that be too late? Because that would have to be proposed legislation, correct?
Well, I mean, just as a reminder, this bill went in, the bill that created this committee went in at like the
Yeah, it
last
was-
minute.
Yeah, it was like the last week we was actually at legislature. So I mean, it was put in as an emergency bill, and I'm sure that
Yeah.
we're there until June now, and we can
Yeah.
put something in,
And that was the short session when we did this.
correct.
Yeah, so we have some time.
Yes.
We have a few more meetings in front of us. Where we would have an opportunity to put a line item in the DACF budget for a caseworker. If that was the direction that everyone decided we wanted to go in. There also might be the possibility that
the fund might be able to support that role. So we can do a little bit of a deeper dive into the way it's written and see whether that's possible. So, so we have a minute.
I
guess
would
it's
say at this point, I think that this committee needs to, continue doing the work they're doing and try to keep the legislature out of it. And I mean, and I'm saying this from a legislative standpoint. We heard a bill this morning that they wanted us to put into buy farms and pay a minimum of $20,000 per acre for farms, and we had 9 months to figure it out. Well, that just isn't feasible. And I know that the senator and Beth were both there and testified against this bill, just because there's a lot of legislators that don't even realize that this committee is here and what we're doing for work. And I think personally, I think this is where, like, the grounds starting from ground zero, this is where we need to come back, and we can make the suggestions to the legislature what needs to work instead of them telling us what we need to do. So I'd continue doing our work the way it is, and if something comes up, I mean, either any of us are glad to put in anything, and it's right up until the last minute, and if not, even next year we could put in for more.
We could get it in first thing next year as an emergency.
Exactly.
If we needed it. Yeah.
Because all of this is happening to farmers, because we are downstream of what consumers are doing and how consumers are disposing of their products and how consumers waste and their bio waste are not monitored. Wouldn't it be beneficial to either recommend or put legislation in that really deals with that? I know there's a couple bills that are handling a very, very small percentage of PFAS entering our work streams and our life streams. But that's more a policy thing, and that has to do with systems of agriculture. Agriculture is a very small part, and we are truly the downstream victims of all of this. So do we recommend that maybe we perhaps don't have a lot of these products, or we take better care of human waste?
So that is a great question. In the 130th, so the last legislative cycle, the first year we passed a bill, it's a source reduction bill. So by 2030, it requires manufacturers to eliminate intentionally added PFAS from consumer products. By 2023, this year, they're supposed to be reporting to us if they have intentionally added PFAS in their products. So we have this sort of phase out plan in place for PFAS in consumer products. We have a ban in place for food packaging, for textiles, for carpets. So we're getting there. It's really hard to ask manufacturers to pivot when our market is so small with 1.3 million people compared to the larger rest of the United States. So it's coming. It's just it can't happen overnight.
Right, but what about managing the waste?
It's a biosolids.
Poop, yeah, people.
Yeah,
poop.
so
we manage our poop on farm. I have a $22,000 document that I have to put together every few years.
Yeah.
That manages all of our manure.
So the big step we took last session was we're the first state in the union to ban land application of the biosolids and sludge.
Right, but landfilling is also a problem and a contributory problem. So I'm wondering, where is the bettering the stewarding of the poop?
Right. Well, so it's going to take a minute is the answer. The goal is to get to a place where source reduction is in place. We've started to ratchet down on the amount of PFAS in the poop, and then we could potentially go back to or look at a beneficial reuse program for sludge, but we're not there yet. So maybe you would like to chime in about from the DEP's perspective in terms of an approach for biosolids.
Sure. I mean, we're working on it. And the wastewater utilities are working on it because they're the ones that are in the pinch now because they were land spreading all of their sludge. Now their only option is landfilling. The landfills are saying, we're not going to take your sludge. And there's no place else for it to go. And we don't have any effectively demonstrated treatment technology. And so we're working with lots of different equipment vendors and researchers and the entire wastewater community. We're working with New England Interstate Water Pollution Control Commission. They're going to do a regional study. We're engaged with people nationally and internationally to try to figure out what are we going to do with all of these biofilms, because until we can get the PFAS out of them, we even where, right now landfilling is the only option, there isn't the capacity to landfill everything that we're operating. And so we're in a place where we've got an awful lot of poop that's got no place to go. And at a point where I would hesitate to call it a crisis situation, but it's pretty darn close to it.
There's one little embellishment I'll add to that, which is that the one side benefit to the landfill experience for the sludge is that we have a very concentrated leachate that we can filter for the PFAS, and then we capture the PFAS again. So whenever we provide the ability to concentrate it, catch it, capture it, we're like steps away from destructive technology. And when we've captured it, we can then destroy it. But it's very hard to destroy it in the sludge form, in soil. We can filter it out of water and we can filter it out of leachate. And so it does give us an opportunity for destruction in that experience of the landfill. It's totally not ideal, but it's like a diamond in the rough, if you will.
So other than throwing, a couple $100 million at some treatment technology, and we are definitely working really, really hard at trying to put some systems in place, figure out what facilities could operate, what kind of treatment technologies to do it. But there isn't anything else the legislature could do other than direct money towards it.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
I have two things. I'm surprised to hear that the legislatures, a lot of people are unaware of the $60 million fund in the committee here.
Oh,
You should have heard the committee today.
Yeah,
It's just
that's a little,
2,300 bills, they're just not paying attention.
yeah,
yeah.
I figure 60 million would raise some eyebrows, but where does the leachate go now? Like you're talking about, we're concentrating this and then we have this stuff somewhere. So what is
It goes to
current,
wastewater treatment plants.
and then
it goes through treatment technology that's not designed for PFAS, and then it's discharged.
in a concentrated format
In the surface water.
in the surface water, which I think is maybe what we're getting at as farmers here, is that that seems to be a major. And then on top of that, is there waste coming from out of state, coming into the state to be processed and shipped back out? So are we really getting to the bottom of this? And I'm not sure why Casella still has a permit in my neighborhood. I'm not exactly, I can't figure out why that permit has not been revoked. And I think that research hopefully will show this, that let them sue the state. It's doing worse damage what they're doing now. It's like openly worse damage in front of our face than a lawsuit. I hope the research can prove this, because the leachate that's just being released now is a huge concern to surface water. And probably some communities in our state might be unfairly impacted by that. And I can think of some in particular. We're living downstream, there's 4 of us here.
I did have a question that was sort of off. I don't know if this is legislatively, but one of the people that spoke up at the public hearing, because it was falling under that DOD umbrella, seemed completely unaware of options and opportunities and resources and help available for them. Is there anything we can do as an advisory? I mean, I know we're doing so much, but how do we fill this chasm? I mean, DEP and DACF seem to be working really well. But I feel like, and I know that this has been an issue because of the two ag issues that I've dealt with. One has fallen under ag and DEP, and the other one is fallen under DOD across the country. So is there any space for us or any ability for us or to make sure that people who maybe think it's just a DOD issue and don't realize there's agricultural assistance? Can we fix everything today? I'm sorry, that was a question. I don't know if it was appropriate for now, but it just remember that from the public hearing. I just felt I'm just really glad. And the person wasn't a farmer. He was asking on behalf of a neighbor who was an agriculturalist. So.
I'm not sure I have an answer.
Okay, no, that's a good answer.
How much PFAS research is there to like hop onto and couple, like, is there a fair amount of information or very, very tiny amounts about the health impacts and all that on people and the environment? Or are we really starting from like basic zero?
We're not starting from zero. I would say, relevance to Maine, we might be close to zero.
Mhm.
But, nationally, internationally, what's been done, there's information that I know the state is relying on and the main researchers are relying on. So
It's a good
it's not
foundation.
totally zero, but in comparison to other research topics, it's pretty slim in my opinion.
Thank you.
Okay, so, we didn't quite answer all of your questions, did we?
I appreciate this document. I do think one thing that came up in the committee hearing to the public hearing today is that the idea of the short term and long term is not this is what you're eligible for, but it was how we divided up our planning. And I think that caught some of the legislators off guard. They may not have come at it with that understanding. I don't know if there's any way to make sure that they understand that in writing, but
That's a good point. I'll make a note to clarify that. We're hoping that Representative Hall will go back and make it all right for us.
Well, I think that one thing is that report is due, you said March 1st.
Right.
And I think we can put the work session out after
Yeah.
that, which I'm sure this is going to be helpful to the committee if they've seen this written report
Agreed.
before we have our work session.
Yep.
I hope.
Okay. So like I said, I'll tweak the little bit about or clarify. So the concern at the hearing this morning was that, we're talking about a 24-month period being defined as the short term during which we would develop a suite of programs to really help farmers make informed decisions about how to proceed forward. And there was some concern that, well, for somebody whose PFAS contamination was discovered 4 or 5 years ago, they wouldn't be eligible for anything. And that is absolutely not the case. But like Jenny said, for our planning purposes, we want to have supports going forward for people within that 24-month period. But we also need to be clear that presently impacted farmers are also eligible for the programs that will be coming out of the PFAS fund. Yeah, so I will make that change, give it a good proofread, send it back out to the advisory committee. Let me know if you want edits. Where it goes to the legislative committees.
Thank you for all your work, Beth.
Yeah,
yes.
Really awesome job managing all of this.
it's extremely thorough. It makes it very easy to digest and stuff. Yeah,
Yeah, for sure.
extremely thorough.
Glad to hear that. Thank you.
She was a very compassionate and empathetic speaker today at the hearing. So thank you for that.
Okay. Gosh. It is for right on time. Thanks, everybody, and thank you for putting up with the audio visual.
Thanks for
Louis, this-
attendees on Zoom.
Thank you.
Thank you. Nice to meet you.
Very welcome. I just have to remember to take a paper towel off.